This week's Just You Award goes to Karen Sarmento. Her podcast is called We Are Meant for More. As a passionate and dedicated nurse practitioner for more than 18 years and a Proctor Gallagher certified mindset mentor, she specializes in empowering women. And not only that, when I listen to her podcast, I feel as though she's just talking to me. I don't hear you guys or hey everybody. It feels very personal. So kudos to you, Karen, for the Just You Award.
To walk in love. And that's the whole focus of my book. What happens when the generations come into alignment? That's the big mystery of my book.
Has your life, your dreams been interrupted? Good news. It is possible to reinvent our lives. People are doing it every day, and some are brave enough to share the struggles, disappointments, and challenges. If you are looking for a new beginning, a do-over, or to rediscover your passion, maybe even find a new one, then grab a cup of coffee and let's talk. Interrupted, Act 2, Reinventing Your Legacy, with your host, Coach Lori.
It's a tale of two wagons, a life of resounding joy. How one family's love affair with Jesus can be your family's storyline too. Marlee Huber is the author. Welcome.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Congratulations on your book.
This is a book about legacy. It's about what are you passing on to future generations that's really going to guide their life when you're not there to whisper in their ear. Your title is Interrupted. I experienced the power of a radical interruption. My husband decided he wanted to bicycle to his brother's house in 2012. His brother lives in Virginia. We live in Washington State. And that was going to be 90 days. And my life was going to be interrupted. I wasn't too keen on leaving my garden. I mean, we live in the Northwest all year, so we can experience summer. And I would be leaving my little grandbabies and my garden. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do that, but I stepped away from my routine, my regular, to step into his big dream. And I don't know that many of us are comfortable stepping into someone else's big dream. So we were gone for 90 days. He bicycled. I drove the truck, pulled the trailer, and ran my camera on auto because I didn't know how to use it. If the buttons got moved, I'm like, Clark, you have to fix it because I don't know what I did. But I would have 4 or 5 hours a day while he was bicycling just to practice composition, just to focus my eyes, looking for beauty as we crossed the country on the back roads of America, meeting the insignificant people, the flyover states. What happened was when we came back, he went back to work as if nothing had happened. I came back totally, radically changed. I could not do what I'd done before. I stepped into this new space of creativity. For about 6 years, I felt like I was supposed to withdraw from a lot of the things I'd been involved with, the groups I'd been involved with. It was a very quiet period of my life. As I was learning how to run a camera, I was learning f-stops, how a little hole can have a big number, something I thought I could never learn. I practiced focusing that camera and learning and being still. And I think the book could not be what it is today had I not had that time of deep stillness, that time where I just radically was pulled away from everything that I knew. Every day was a new adventure, but there was so much deep stillness in it. And I heard a radio broadcast. She talked about busy poker. She said, we go to the grocery store and we see somebody we haven't seen in 6 months. And we go, oh, Susie, it's so good to see you. Oh my goodness, I've missed you. What's happening in your life? And she goes, oh, I've been so busy. And you go, me too. And then it's like you play poker to see who was the busiest over the last 6 months since you've seen each other. It can really accelerate. I learned I needed to draw back from busy poker. Sometimes now somebody goes off on how busy they are. I'll just say, oh, I'm sorry. Because life is meant to be enjoyed in the moment, in the process. For many years, I have to say from the time my children were little, I would hear this still small voice saying, be still and know that I am God. And being still was the hardest thing for me. I didn't realize if I would be still, then I would know. I would know so much. I would get so much wisdom and understanding. And it was a battle. And I really think this trip across America cut things very significantly. So when I came back, I was in this new space, and I think I was able to write the book from that space of deep stillness. As I processed, I began to learn about breathing deeply, and the spirit is breath, learning to breathe and learning to listen and learning to process. The book rides on the story. And people tell me, those are good stories. Oh my, it kept me up half the night. But there's a second level to this book, and it's the deep stillness that I want people to enter into. And I have some people say, I had to go back and reread, and there were parts I had to reread. I needed to slow down. I started out really quickly, but I had to slow down because there's so much there.
Just this morning, I was talking with a friend about that whole busy thing. People say to me all the time, you're so busy. And really, I'm not. I'm scheduled because I work and I have interviews, but I'm not busy or hurried at all. One thing that I realized is having your own home business or being an entrepreneur, author, whatever, coach, is that there's often this feeling to hustle. I've been living in this space of stepping back and of being peaceful and listening and being quiet. And it feels very counterintuitive to building a business. And yet it has been what has changed me, because I feel like, and I don't know if this is true for everyone, but sometimes busy can just be running from the very thing that God might be calling us to.
Exactly. I probably did that. I'm easily distracted. I think most of us are easily distracted. What's that squirrel over there? And there off we run. So getting focused to write the book was extremely painstaking. I had a friend one day say that she felt God telling her that she needed to post more pictures on Facebook. She needed to share her photography. And she responded back, well, but Marlee's are much prettier than mine. And she heard God say, but Marlee is supposed to be writing a book. I'll tell you, that set me back on my heels. And I'm like, I better get focused. And it was that word from a friend who focused me to step back and really get serious about writing this book. Because the first time I wrote on this topic, I was a senior in college, and that was in 1972. I wrote my first paper on my grandfather in a class, the Western American history. And my grandfather's story had always captivated me. He died before I was 2 years old. So how do you write a 384-page book about a man who died before you were 2 years old, a man you only have one memory? But in the deep stillness, in the stories, fortunately, as a college student, I collected stories. I had documents because my family was still alive. I could take that and I could go deep with it. I'll just share one part from the book. I was given my grandfather's rocking chair, and it was the chair where he would sit and pray. Now, I was the youngest grandchild, so I didn't know this, but my older cousins would tell me every morning they'd run across the barnyard to Grandpa and Grandma's house, and they would find Grandpa sitting in his chair, reading his Bible and praying. I mean, that was a given. That's just what Grandpa did. I think he probably sat in that chair, 40 years or so. Well, when I was in my 20s, my aunt gave me the chair. So in the process of writing the book, I had a coach say to me, what if you sat in the chair for 30 days? I sat in the chair for 30 days and I thought, what portion of scripture would I read? And I decided I would every day read the same thing. So I chose the book of Philippians. It's very short, 4 chapters. You can read it in about 10 minutes, and it's all on joy. It's on joy when you're going through really tough times. Now, I had one of the professors at my daughter's college. He had cancer, and in his treatment, every day he read the book of Philippians out loud because it's joy during tough times. That's probably 20 years ago. He's doing well. And I thought, wow, there's something powerful about pressing into joy. So I sat there for 30 days and I read the book of Philippians, and then old hymns started to play through my mind. And I'm like, well, I wonder if this was old enough that my grandfather might have have had this one going through his mind. And pretty soon I had a whole list of hymns. And then I realized that, they say matter carries memory of what's happened. And I thought, I wonder what memories are in this chair. What memories are embedded in the wood of this chair? And one day, it was near the end of my 30 days, I was sitting there, and all of a sudden I realized my grandfather had prayed for my conception in this chair. So my parents were married 10 years and they were childless. My mother was pregnant one other time. She never told me. My dad and my cousin told me. And it was a little boy. She miscarried, and my grandfather's heart was broken because my dad was his only son, and here he was childless. And then they lost the little boy. All of a sudden, it was like God just spoke to my heart, and I knew in this chair, my grandfather had prayed for my conception. But he hadn't just prayed for my conception. He had prayed for my whole life through. A life that would be abundant, a life that would be glorious and a blessing. And I sat with tears running down my cheeks, knowing that I was sitting in that very chair. So my book offers a lot of hope for people who are hopeless. Maybe it's infertility. Maybe they've always wanted to be married. Maybe their children are straying, and maybe there's no communication. Right now, it's really rampant that generations are isolated. Children are isolating their children from the grandparents. What a tragic thing to do. But it's happening. I hear the stories over and over again. My book is about giving hope to people because it's a book about legacy. Shortly after I had this experience, I was writing about sitting in the rocking chair and this whole experience, just putting it in the book. I received a phone call from a friend. Now, this friend is what we would call an intercessor. She has prayed over the city of Seattle for 50 years. And she will go on prayer assignments. God will call her to Florida or Washington, D.C. She's been in the Oval Office. She's been in the Pentagon. She gets places. You don't call Valerie and ask Valerie to pray for you. You hear from Valerie. Valerie calls me one day and she says, Marlee, what's up? What are you doing? I said, I'm writing a book. And she said, well, tell me about it. Because she said, for the last 3 weeks, God has placed you on my heart. I have been praying for you. And my breath was taken away because, like I said, you don't call Valerie. God tells Valerie where to go, what to do. So I knew that this book was very important and what I had written was very important. And all of a sudden, so I decided to tell her the story. And all of a sudden she was in tears and I was in tears. And she's like, Marlee, I so feel the presence of the Lord on this. So that's just a little vignette into the book. It's a story of a grandfather who was an alcoholic. He had everything going against him that modern youth have. He lost his father when he was 11. They were thrown off the farm because if a man couldn't make it, well, a woman and 4 children couldn't make it. They ended up homeless, penniless. He got into alcoholism, the wrong group of friends, self-pity, unforgiveness, hopelessness, and that's where he found community, and that's where the book starts. But that's not where the book ends, because he had a radical transformation that has affected the life of our family now for 125 years. What lasts in our culture 100 years? Not much. A new president comes into office, and like the first day, all these executive orders are signed. Everything's rescinded that was done in the last 4 years. And he's the most powerful man in the world. New companies last rarely 5 years. For a company to last 100 years, it really has to transform and morph into something different. American Telegraph and Telephone. AT&T, we now have cell phones, but it started out as telegraph, like 1869, or I think that was the date. The telegraph's going across America. But a family that has a foundation in faith can walk in generational blessings. We're now into the 7th generation in our family, and the majority of our family follows in the values of this grandfather who sat and prayed, who got still in this rocking chair, who listened for next steps. That's really the story of this book. What happens when people read my book? You begin drawing on your story. So I talk in this book about finding the silver cord of glory that flows through your family. I've had a prayer group in my home now for about 10 years, and I've met so many women who are isolated from their grandchildren, and their hearts are breaking. Now, the children have bought into the line, mom's toxic, or mom, I don't like how she does things, or maybe mom is too much of a controller and she hasn't let go of her children and she's still trying to micromanage them. That never works. My daughter and I have a lot of conversations about this because she sees it from the perspective of her generation. I see it from the perspective of my generation. She said, Mom, you never said anything when I wanted to marry a Black man. And I said, no, honey, we embraced Tyrone. And she said, Mom, you never said anything when I said I wanted to homeschool my children. No, honey. I think the third one was, Mom, you didn't say anything when I wanted to put a pink streak in my hair. No, I didn't say anything. Because when you pray, when you hold your children in God's hands, you don't have to micromanage them. So micromanaging them does cut off relationship. It severs. Here's a reason why those relationships are so important. Even if you have to gulp and say, I don't know, I'm going to have to grit my teeth. Well, I did some of that too. My mother-in-law always came to our home and she wanted to know what was for dinner. And she was very organized, 1, 2, 3, methodical. I'm play it by ear. She would want to get in and start cooking on dinner. So finally, and I would that's my kitchen. But finally I learned, hey, if she wants to come to my house and cook dinner, I'm all for it. So I learned to accept who she was, and she accepted who I was, and we got along really well. In my research, I discovered a couple psychologists who did a study before 9/11, and it was a study on what makes children emotionally resilient so that they can weather the tough times in life. And they came up with 20 questions that children should know the answers to, like, where did mom and dad meet? Where'd they grow up? Where'd they go to school? How did they meet? What were first jobs? All these different questions. Now, the whole point is not to sit your children down and like it's midterms and teach them the 20 questions. But the whole point is in conversation over family dinner, on family trips, begin to tell the stories. Now, if you can add in stories of the grandpas and the grandmas, you have even more identity for the child to tap into. They went out and they studied all these children, and the children who knew the most answers to the 20 questions seemed to be more emotionally resilient than those who did not. But they had a grand opportunity, unfortunately, to try that, and that was when 9/11 happened. They went back to these families, and they discovered that those children who knew more of the answers to the 20 questions weathered that deeply emotional time in American history much better than the kids who weren't grounded in their own identity and their own family identity. When moms and dads feel like, I can't trust my mom, this, that, she feeds them the wrong thing, she does this, she does that, what happens is they are literally cutting off their children from a great sense of their own identity. That continuity of generations that flows through, it's lost. So if I were to tell you a story, it's a story in the book, but it's probably, wow, it's a profound story. When our daughter was 5 years old, she said, Mom, I want to give my heart to Jesus. And I said, okay, let's go kneel down by your bed and pray. We went and we prayed, and she never turned back on her faith. She was always strong in her faith. When she was in her late teens, she was in a youth group, and in that youth group, periodically they would have an opportunity to share their story, share their testimony. And she would stand up and she would go, I was 5 years old and I gave my heart to Jesus. And she would sit down. Now they would roll their eyes and think, this is banal. Get a testimony, they would tell her. because they love the testimony with the drama, the testimony where somebody almost committed suicide and was pulled back and then found Jesus, or where they ran away from home and they got into drugs and they lived on the street and they were under a bridge and someone called to them and they realized they need to come out from under the bridge and they found Jesus. They love those testimonies, but they didn't so much love hers. So she came home and I said, honey, why don't you tell them about your great-grandfather? And because of your great-grandfather's decision, how he became a Christian, how he was instantly delivered from alcohol, never touched a drop of it ever in his life again. Because of that, you walk in family generational blessings. You didn't have to go out and, because of lack of identity, try to commit suicide, or you didn't go off into drugs or alcoholism like he did, because you had an anchor, you had a family, you had values and practices that were passed down through the generations. So she went back and told them that story. Here's what happened to them. They looked at her and they said, Suzanne, could we be part of your family? I want to be part of your family. She would say, you are starting your own family generation of blessing, line of blessing, like my grandfather did. Your first generation, you are like my grandfather. The best thing for me is when I get a report back from somebody reading this book who has gone through addiction, who's come out on the other side, they're reading my book, and they ask the person who gave them the book, could you ask Marlee to pray for me? Because I want a family legacy with my children like her grandfather had with his.
That is so beautiful. You know, my website is Leaving a Legacy. We often don't tell the stories. Something you said was very key, because it's not enough drama, or maybe it's too much drama. And so often we don't tell the stories because we don't believe they matter. Just one little story in my family, and I know that I've shared this with my kids, but when my son had his son, they put his middle name after my daughter-in-law's grandpa's last name. And so I said, oh, that's like you, Davis. He goes, what? I go, yeah, you were named after Ma and Pa Davis, Ken's Corner on Whidbey Island. And he goes, what? Davis is a family name. He knew it, but he didn't remember, because I know that both his dad and I had told him. But what it really clenched for me is not only is it important to tell our story, but to write it, to record it, even if you hate your voice, even if you hate yourself on video, even if you hate your handwriting, because when you're gone, we had a recent loss in the family, what they would give anything to have.
More story.
Video, audio, anything. Leaving that legacy for the family to find is so incredible. And Marlee, I love how you said to your daughter, instead of, well, they'll have to get over it, but that you said, well, let's look back where you came from. I love that. I just think of all the stories, Marlee, that you have told me, that I share in my webinars and my workshop. You have always brought such wisdom, and I feel like this book is just full of that kind of wisdom, kind of unconventional, where we'll read it and we'll go, oh, that makes sense.
Right. It's learning to walk in love. And that's the whole focus of my book. What happens when the generations come into alignment? That's the big mystery in my book. So my book starts with a story, but there's a mystery. I think that my book probably will be relevant for many, many years, because there's an unfolding that happens in the end. You mentioned the trip across America. When my husband was ready to go, and it was tough to be interrupted. My life's going to be interrupted. Well, I always say if it's not fun, it's not worth doing. So I love a little adventure, a little fun. And just in passing, a friend of mine said to me just before we left, get a Liberty Bell and ring it across America. You probably heard me talk about my vow. I forgot all about it till we got to Eureka, Montana, and I got an email about the Queen's 60th anniversary, Queen Elizabeth, and they were going to ring all the bells in London. And at the bottom of the email, it talked about the importance of the bell and of sound. What the bell does is it vibration that goes out over the area, over the territory. And that's what our stories do. They have a vibration that goes out over the generations. If we will tell that story, it will pass on and on. Now, I would say that your son's name means more to him now than it did, because there's a link there between the generations. It's tying back in. So the bell is the same way. It goes out across the countryside. If you live in a place where bells ring, you get to know the sound of your own bell. Email said, get a bell and ring it. And I'm like, I'm in Eureka, Montana, which means I found it. But where am I going to find a bell? So I walked up and down the street to find a bell. I found a school bell that sounded horrible. I'm like, I'm not ringing that. And then I stood at a corner. I was at the end of town. What do I do now? I turned around and there was a sign that said around the corner, art and antiques. And I turned around and I thought, what? There was a little store up the alley in the backyard. There had a big open sign, but when you got close, had a little buzzer and it said, ring the bell and I will come. So I push the button. The next thing I know, this tiny, probably maybe 4'9", little tiny lady comes out of her house carrying her cash box. And I know I'm going to buy. So she lets me into her store and it was amazing. Her paintings were around the top of the room, wonderful oil paintings of her childhood in Poland. She had her book on the counter and she's one who inspired me to get my book done. She had cards and calendars and I said, I need a Liberty Bell to ring across America. She reached up behind her and grabbed this bell and pulled it down, and I knew that was my bell. So I bought the bell, but I didn't just get a bell. I got a story. When she was 17, her family was taken by boxcar to Kazakhstan for 3 years of hard labor. So that's her first book that she probably wrote when she was in her 70s. Then her father walked in from Siberia. They thought he was dead, but he walked in from Siberia and said, we're going to Iran. They went to Iran for 3 years of hard labor. She wrote that book when she was probably in her 80s. We just returned from her 100th birthday party. And she just released her third book when she met her American GI. But what's so interesting about the bell, we went at her 100th birthday party and I carried this bell across America, rang it in all kinds of places, but probably the most memorable place was a little town in Kentucky. I walked in a craft shop that was Appalachian crafts, as opposed to my Alicia, who I bought the bell from, who was classically trained in Europe, spoke languages, played the piano, danced. I mean, she did all of the creative stuff. And I meet this little gal, I'll call her Sue. Sue began to tell me her life story, and it was very tragic. Very, very tragic. She was forced to leave school at 16. She was bit by a hog, had to have plastic surgery on her leg, had to begin feeding the hog because if you're afraid of something, you need to run to it. That was her punishment. That's what she had to do. She begged to be able to get her GED. Well, there was a woman running for governor that year, and her dad said, well, if that woman gets elected, then you can study for your GED. And Sue said, you have no idea how hard I prayed that that woman would be elected. Well, she was elected, and her father kept her his word. So she had to study under the blankets at night with a flashlight. But she got her GED. On her 18th birthday, she got on a bus to Dallas, Texas. She got off the bus. There was a motel. She went over to check in. It was a house of prostitution. But the madam welcomed her in, told everybody she's not one of us, don't touch her. Sue got a job in downtown Dallas, and every day the madam would call a taxi to come pick up Sue and take her to her job and bring her home at night. The madam became her savior. Where her father should have been her protector, the madam was her savior. Well, Sue went on. She married a man. Unfortunately, he was not faithful to her. There was a divorce. There was a broken family, and she was devastated. She carried a lot of woundedness. She carried a lot of bitterness and unforgiveness at what had happened. And so as I stood in that store that day, I just said to her, can I pray for you? And I want you to ring my bell. I handed her my bell and she began to ring it. And I prayed for her. And then I left the store. 3 years later, we were back in Kentucky and I had lunch with this gal. And she said to me, that day, my life was changed forever. She said, when I rang that bell, I decided I was going to let go of all bitterness, all unforgiveness. She said, I called my son and told him, I'm letting go of all of it. I hope you'll do the same. The power of sound, the power of story, passing through the generations. I call those two ladies the bookends to my trip. One classically trained, one trained in the mountains of Appalachia. The one with the bells sent a bell to the other one. And she said, I ring the bell for Alicia every day. Maybe that's why Alicia's lived to be 100. Story is the most powerful tool. It is the link between one generation and another. It's a link between two women who live a couple thousand miles away from each other. But the story of the bell, bring it over each person who's listening to this podcast, because somewhere, if there's some pain, some hurt, some lack of identity, some place where you lack story or your story hurts a lot, I want you to know that there's healing in the sound of the bell. Just like there was for Sue. It's really about what happens when you have the power of a radical interruption. Maybe it's someone else's idea and it's hard for you to go along with it. You're like, well, I really don't want to do that. But wow, it may be all about change for you that opens up, going from the cocoon to the butterfly. That's what it was for me. Maybe it's time to let go of that busy poker, to focus on something like I focused on that camera for all those years that helped me focus on the storytelling. Maybe it's being still and knowing. As we come into deep stillness, all creativity comes out of deep stillness. It doesn't come out of the noise, but it comes out of the deep stillness. So I like to talk about finding your identity, which is really what happened with me, stepping into your creativity and being endorsed that what you're doing in your life is going to have the ripple effects of the sound that vibrates out across the country, out across the generations.
Marlee, thank you so much. How can I get your book?
My book is not available on Amazon. And the reason is this is a hardcover book. It's a legacy book. It's a workbook. There are things you can work through. It's a book that I have vision for, seeing it transform lives, like the story that I told you, like another story I could tell you of a woman who read it, who had been out of contact with her daughter pretty much only 2 phone calls the year before, read the book. She's reading the part about how to hear God. She hears God and they have a conversation. And he says, it's that prayer you prayed. And she's like, what? And then the phone rings and it was her daughter. So my book is only available from my website, which is radiantlifemapping.com. Radiant Life Mapping. It's because I want to be able to touch that book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
If you love this podcast, here's a big ask. Will you share with your friends and family, subscribe, give us a review, and a 5-star rating so that others looking to reinvent their lives will be able to get the help they're looking for? Thank you in advance.